When we think of political scoundrels, names like James Trafficant, John Edwards, and Rod Blagojevich come to mind. Incredible politicians with incredible haircuts who committed incredible crimes against the public trust. And we wonder, when did they go astray? But we're assuming that they were on the right path to begin with. We like to believe that these politicians set out on their journeys with backpacks full of good intentions, that a sense of duty to the greater good is driving them towards positions of leadership. Then, when the indictments are unsealed and the resignations are announced at teary press conferences, we talk in religious metaphors. We say they have fallen from grace. But what about the politicians that are no good from the get-go? What about the politicians whose narrative arcs aren't a rise and fall, but more of a slither from one hole to the next? You'll have never heard of Jerome Block Jr. or the office he was running for in 2008. But if there was an election today for the biggest scumbag in the history of American democracy, his name is the one I'd write in. I'd taken the job with the Santa Fe Reporter for the express purpose of covering the 2008 presidential election from a swing state. I wasn't disappointed. New Mexico was as purple as a bruised plum. It seemed like Obama and Michelle and Hillary and Bill and John McCain and whoever his wife was were in town every other day. Campaign money was flooding in because we had 2 out of 3 congressional seats up for grabs in the first open Senate race in a quarter of a century. Then there was our governor, the lovable, huggable, blue jeans and bolo tie wearing Bill Richardson, who was running for president. He somehow managed to stay in the contest through the Iowa and New Hampshire primaries. Even after he bowed out, Richardson squeezed his potential endorsement for every ounce of political capital. The entire press corps was so high on the top of the ticket campaigns that none of us bothered to vet the candidates for Public Regulation Commission. The Public Regulation Commission is an obscure but enormously powerful agency whose technocratic commissioners regulate everything under the New Mexico sun. Corporations, utilities, insurance companies, the upkeep of pipelines, and the transportation of cadavers. You name it, they regulate it. And to be an effective commissioner, you have to be both number cruncher and consumer advocate, with a working knowledge of law, economics, and science. There were 5 guys in the Democratic primary who met those qualifications to some extent or another. There was one guy who met none of them. Jerome Block Jr. No one took Block seriously. During early appearances on the campaign trail, he came across as a dolt with no practical experience in civic affairs. He was a candidate who talked like he had too much spit in his mouth and not enough blood flow in his skull. The only thing he had going for him was name recognition. His father, also named Jerome Block, had previously held the position. His grandfather, Johnny Block, had been mayor of Espanola. The 6-way race split the vote so thin that Block won the primary with only 23% of the vote. The Republicans hadn't bothered to put up a challenger because the district leaned so heavily Democratic. It looked like the job was Block's by default, until the Green Party nominated a candidate. And that meant the game was on again. I started by taking a second look at a survey the candidates had filled out many months earlier for the daily newspaper. One of the questions had asked about prior arrests and convictions. Block admitted he'd been arrested on a drunk driving charge, but he claimed the court had found him not guilty. Something didn't smell right about that, and I guessed it was Block's breath. So I dove right into the court records. The night he was arrested, Block had blown more than double the legal limit. He'd confessed to police that he'd been drinking beers and Long Island iced tea. But in New Mexico, prosecutors only have 6 months to try DUI cases. Jerome Block Jr.'s lawyer stalled until the clock ran out, and the charges were dropped. I kept digging. I traced an incomplete jail booking record in the sheriff's database to a forgotten file buried in the municipal court archives. In scribbled police handwriting, there was a long narrative about how Jerome Block Jr. and a friend were caught speeding away ludicrously drunk from a domestic violence scene. Block had pleaded guilty, and since he hadn't disclosed it in that newspaper survey, that made Jerome Block Jr. a big, fat liar. I kept pulling at the thread and unraveled another criminal charge for, quote, disorderly conduct. During Albuquerque's most popular street fair, Jerome Block Jr. was busted for urinating in public on a bush. And not just any bush, a bush on police station property. Block, I realized, was a special kind of moron who deserved a special kind of scrutiny. And so, I headed over to family court. Nothing quite feels like a violation of privacy as reading through a politician's family court records. I felt pretty gross for doing it, but not nearly as disgusting as Block turned out to be. See, the record showed that Jerome Block Jr. was a deadbeat dad. He'd refused to pay child support for years. Perhaps even worse is that he failed to appear at any of the mediation or custody hearings. So, I shouldn't have been surprised when Jerome Block Jr. failed to appear for our interview. I broke the story in the next issue. In an election cycle that had so far been dominated by internet memes and foot-in-the-mouth moments, suddenly the press had a real villain. The media invaded Jerome Block Jr.'s life like feral pigs on rural farmland. We tore up everything. Block had defaulted on bank loans. He lied about his campaign endorsements. When he tried to pass off what he had tried to pass off as a business degree was actually just a certificate from a 16-day training program. He'd had a restraining order against him for allegedly threatening to cut a dude. He ditched out on debates. He made illegal campaign expenditures. He could not even spell Public Regulation Commissioner correctly on his website. It got to the point that we were dropping bombshells on Jerome Block Jr. almost every week. And through it all, I never spoke to Block directly. He was like this elusive, mythical slug who left a slimy paper trail behind him. I'd sit at my desk in the reporter's Adobe office, hunched over my bubble of an iMac, clicking and searching, fact-checking every claim he made. I'd craft these sadistic emails to his campaign manager, going through the motions of asking for comment, even though I know he'd never directly respond. I became more and more isolated from my normal life. I'd work 12 hours at the office, then come home and eat dinner in front of cable news. During the closest primaries, I'd leave the TV on overnight so I could wake up in the wee hours to check the tallies. John King with his magic wall and Chris Matthews with his tingly leg. These became the characters of my world. When NBC's Tim Russert died, I shed real tears. New Mexico was my battlefield in this shared nationwide theater of war. I often wondered whether I was taking it too far with Jerome Block Jr., but I had this fireball of journalistic righteousness inside me, and I was convinced I could burn his campaign to the ground. The Public Regulation Commissioner race is unique in that the campaigns are publicly financed. Jerome Block Jr. didn't have to fundraise. Instead, taxpayers had given him almost $100,000 to spend. I went through Block's campaign reports line by line, cross-checking every expense. One payment jumped out at me. Block had paid a guy named Paul Maass $300 for, quote, campaign coordination. I Googled him. Pecos Paul Maass was a top election official in San Miguel County, where Block had the strongest turnout in the primary. Then there was a $2,500 payment to a band called Wild Country for a performance at a campaign rally. $2,500 seemed like an awful lot of money for a single show. I Googled it too. Pecos Paul was the band's guitarist. I reported it. A couple weeks later, 2 members of Wild Country came forward and said there had never been a performance, and the band hadn't seen a single cent. The money had vanished. The Secretary of State intervened and leveled a $21,000 fine against Block for violating campaign laws. The Attorney General separately opened an investigation into whether Block had embezzled public money. That's when Jerome Block Jr. went over the edge. The morning the news broke about the criminal investigation, Jerome Block Jr. called 911 to report that his house had been, quote, ransacked. Conveniently, the only things missing were his campaign records. Imagine that. The words "Spick Liar" were written on the wall in green crayon. The state police didn't believe him for a second, nor did anyone else. To anyone watching the election, it was clear that Jerome Block Jr. was the worst candidate the state had ever seen. Environmental groups had begun running attack ads against Block on the radio. A local comedian released this video.
DUI, peeing in a bush, giving some dude a serious push. Child support, default loan, paying some band that hadn't really shown. When the clock strikes 1, 2 o'clock, there's gonna be another scandal from Jerome Block. Yeah, it's Block around the clock tonight. If you expect another shot, you're probably right. Tell me what's up, Doc? Well, it's Block around the clock. Conflict of interest, that's hardly news. Failure to appear for interviews. Yeah, it's Block around the clock tonight. If you expect another shock, you're probably right. That ain't no crock. Yeah, it's Block around the clock. Go, Daddy!
And yet, leading Democrats refused to comment one way or another on Block because they were so afraid it would diminish Obama's momentum. A few brazen Democrats began to actively campaign for the Green candidate, risking expulsion from the party. But Rick Lass, the Green Party candidate, was also flawed. First, he was from Michigan, and New Mexican voters are naturally prejudiced against outsiders. More importantly, Rick Lass had once been arrested for a domestic disturbance. He was surprisingly open about it in interviews. There had been no allegations of violence, but that didn't stop Jerome Block Jr.'s father from smearing Rick Lass as a woman beater. And it worked. I'd ask about the race and people would shrug off Block's problems. They'd rather elect a lying, thieving, deadbeat native son than a girlfriend-beating carpetbagger. And actually, those were just the people who'd heard about the race. Most people only recognized his family's name or the big D beside it. On the night of the election, everyone at our watch party celebrated as the Republican grip on America came to an end. I stumbled home seething with frustration. Jerome Block Jr. won with 56% of the vote. He was the chosen candidate of 99,250 New Mexicans. I stopped by Rick Lass's election party at a brewery down the street from my apartment. Pretty much everyone had gone home. Lass was sitting at the bar, a little drunk, with a sad clown expression on his face as the TV replayed clips from Obama's acceptance speech. We didn't say much to each other. He quit politics after that. Elections are over in an instant, but justice drags. The Attorney General eventually indicted Block and his father on a long list of felony charges. Block refused to resign his $90,000 a year job while he awaited trial. Months passed, and I moved to San Diego. One would have expected Jerome Block Jr. to keep his nose clean as he assumed office. After all, there were 100 microscopes trained on his every move. But no. A television station discovered that Block had racked up more than $8,000 in fraudulent charges on government-issued credit cards that were supposed to be used only for gasoline. It was dubbed Chimichanga Gate, because that was one of the many unauthorized purchases alleged in a search warrant affidavit. On top of that, Block was accused of car theft by an auto dealership after he took a Honda Accord on a test drive and never came back. Almost exactly a year ago, Jerome Block Jr. finally resigned from the Public Regulations Commission. He copped a plea in exchange for probation, and the charges were dropped against his father. Block blamed it all on drug addiction. They keep giving Jerome Block Jr. second chances. Every time I look him up online, he's got a new mugshot for a probation violation. In February, February of this year, he was caught text messaging with a teenage girl. She asked if he could hook her up with a certain prescription drug. Block texted back, yes. Of course he did. When we think of political scoundrels, Jerome Block Jr.'s name should come to mind. But we should also be thinking about ourselves, the voters, the press, the political parties. Maybe democracy itself should approach the podium and apologize. But not resign. Never resign. Because even after all that, I still believe the worst scumbag we elect is better than any ruler we don't. Just please, for Jerome Block's sake, read the news before you vote this year. Thank you.